The most powerful paper trail in modern political history isn't sitting in a courtroom. It isn't locked inside a government vault. It is allegedly sitting in a private briefing room in Washington, being reviewed by people whose names you will never see in any headline. And every single page of it has one name written across the top: Mark Carney, the man who just won the most consequential election in Canadian history. The man the international press crowned as the last rational voice in a world gone mad. The man who stood at podiums from Davos to Ottawa and told the world he was different, cleaner, smarter, and untouchable. Those documents say otherwise. And if even half of what is buried inside them is true, the political earthquake that follows will not just flatten one career, it will reshape the entire architecture of Western power. It started, as most Washington scandals do, not with a bang, but with a whisper, a quiet conversation between two senior staffers in the House Judiciary Committee, a reference to a folder that wasn't supposed to exist, a name that had no business appearing inside a classified federal investigation based in Florida. But there it was, Project Maple, Carney 2021 to 2025, 4 years, 47 subfiles, and according to 3 separate sources with direct knowledge of the document review process, a financial trail that connects Mark Carney's private consulting years to entities, transactions, and back-channel communications that his public biography has never once mentioned. To understand why this is so dangerous, you have to understand what Mark Carney was doing between 2020 and 2024. On the surface, the answer is clean and impressive. He was the United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. He was running the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, a coalition of financial institutions managing over $130 trillion in assets. He was the most connected financial mind on the planet, moving between boardrooms in London, Geneva, New York, and Riyadh with the kind of access that sitting heads of state would trade entire diplomatic relationships to obtain. That was the public version. That was the version that got him elected. But Washington's leaked documents are telling a different story entirely. According to individuals who have reviewed portions of the Project Maple files, Carney's role as a global climate envoy was not purely philanthropic. Embedded within his network of green finance commitments were a series of infrastructure investment negotiations totaling an estimated $6.2 billion across 3 separate sovereign wealth fund arrangements that were never disclosed to the Canadian public, never flagged to international ethics bodies, and, according to one particularly explosive subfile, directly intersected with financial structures linked to Trump Organization, adjacent investment vehicles operating through shell entities registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. Read that again. The man running against Trump's economic worldview was allegedly doing quiet financial business inside the same investment ecosystem that Trump's own network was operating in. The timeline here is not accidental, and it is not subtle. In March 2022, Carney gave a landmark speech at the London School of Economics, where he declared that the era of fossil fuel finance was over and that any nation clinging to carbon-dependent economic models was writing its own obituary. The speech was celebrated across Europe. Climate activists quoted it for months, but according to the Project Maple subfiles, in the same quarter that speech was delivered, a financial advisory firm with documented ties to Carney's Post-Bank of England consulting network received a $340 million routing instruction connected to a Qatari infrastructure fund that had co-investment arrangements with 2 Trump-linked real estate development entities. The optics alone are catastrophic. The legal exposure is potentially far worse. Now, here is where it gets darker. The documents don't just allege financial entanglement. They allege knowledge suppression. One of the most explosive claims buried inside the Project Maple files is that in late 2023, as Carney was beginning to position himself for a run at the Liberal Party leadership, his legal team was made aware of a specific set of communications, encrypted signal logs from 2022, that had been captured as part of the broader Mar-a-Lago document seizure investigation. These logs allegedly show that a senior member of Carney's inner advisory circle had direct contact with a Trump administration operative, not to negotiate trade, not to discuss climate policy, but to discuss the terms under which certain financial documentation would remain outside the scope of any future Canadian federal disclosure process. In plain language, someone close to Carney was allegedly negotiating to keep evidence quiet. And according to the Judiciary Committee sources, that negotiation was partially successful until now. The implications of this are staggering because they don't just touch Carney personally. They implicate the entire apparatus that brought him to power. The Liberal Party of Canada ran its entire 2025 election campaign on the platform of transparency, sovereignty, and resistance to foreign economic pressure. Carney himself looked into cameras across the country and told voters that he had no hidden allegiances, no conflicting interests, no secret deals. If the Project Maple files are authentic, every single one of those statements becomes not just a lie, but a documented, prosecutable misrepresentation made to an entire nation during a federal election. And in Canadian law, that carries consequences that go far beyond losing an election. But the most chilling detail in everything that has been leaked so far isn't the money. It isn't the shell companies. It isn't even the encrypted communications. It is a single handwritten annotation reportedly found on the cover page of the Project Maple folder in ink, not typed, not printed, apparently written by someone who had physical access to the file before it entered federal custody. The annotation reads simply, "He knows we have this." 3 words. But in the context of everything surrounding them, those 3 words suggest that this scandal is not a discovery. It is a detonation that was deliberately scheduled. Someone held this information, waited for the precise moment of maximum political impact, and then lit the fuse. And the question that should be keeping Mark Carney awake in Rideau Cottage tonight is not whether the documents are real. The question is who decided that right now, in the 48th hour of his majority government, was the perfect moment to let them out, and what exactly they are expecting him to do next. The moment the Project Maple files entered the conversation inside the House Judiciary Committee, something unusual happened. The standard procedural machinery of Washington, the press briefings, the formal statements, the carefully worded denials, all of it ground to a halt. No one spoke on record. No one issued a clarification. The committee members who had seen the documents went quiet with the kind of silence that, in Washington, doesn't mean there is nothing to say. It means there is too much. And in that vacuum of official response, the secondary explosions began. Because Project Maple was never just one file. It was a nested architecture of interlocking revelations. And the deeper investigators went, the worse the picture became. The second layer of the Project Maple documents focuses on something that has received almost no attention in mainstream coverage, but is arguably more damaging than the financial entanglements themselves. It centers on a previously unknown advisory body referred to in the documents only as the Meridian Group. According to the files, the Meridian Group was an informal but highly structured collection of 12 financial and geopolitical strategists who began meeting privately in early 2021. The meetings rotated between Zurich, Singapore, and a private estate outside Montreal. No minutes were kept. No official membership list exists, but the Project Maple documents allegedly contain attendance records, travel reimbursement logs, and internal briefing papers that place Mark Carney at 7 of the 9 documented Meridian Group gatherings between January 2021 and November 2023. And the agenda of those meetings, according to the briefing papers, was not climate finance. It was the strategic reshaping of North American economic governance in the event of a second Trump presidency. On the surface, that might sound like responsible planning. But the specific contents of what was discussed inside those Meridian Group sessions are what transforms this from precautionary strategy into something far more legally and politically combustible. The briefing papers reportedly outline a coordinated effort to preposition certain financial instruments, regulatory frameworks, and key personnel inside Canadian federal institutions before a Liberal government could formally take power. In other words, the documents suggest that Carney's path to the Prime Minister's office was not simply a response to a political moment. It was the execution of a plan that had been years in the making, involving private financial actors, non-elected strategists, and coordination mechanisms that operated completely outside of any democratic oversight structure. The Canadian electorate did not vote for a candidate. According to these documents, they voted for the visible face of a pre-constructed power architecture. What makes this dimension of the scandal particularly explosive is the international fingerprints on it. The Meridian Group briefing papers don't just implicate Canadian actors. They reference direct input from senior figures connected to the European Central Bank, 2 unnamed Gulf sovereign wealth funds, and a private intelligence consultancy that has documented historical ties to British signals intelligence. The picture being painted is not of a rogue politician cutting private deals for personal gain. It is something more sophisticated and far more unsettling. It is the portrait of a man who was selected, groomed, and inserted into a position of national leadership by a network of global financial and intelligence adjacent actors who had their own reasons for wanting a specific kind of leader running Canada at this specific moment in history. And those reasons, according to the documents, had very little to do with the interests of ordinary Canadians. The Trump angle in all of this is impossible to ignore, and it refuses to remain in the background. Sources within the Department of Justice have confirmed to 3 separate investigative journalists that the Project Maple files were not discovered accidentally during the Mar-a-Lago document review. They were specifically flagged by a member of the DOJ's National Security Division who had been tracking cross-border financial flows connected to the Meridian Group for over 18 months before Carney ever announced his candidacy. This means that elements of the American federal government were monitoring Carney's network while he was still presenting himself to the world as a private citizen with no political ambitions. The surveillance predates the campaign, it predates the liberal leadership race, and it predates every public statement Carney ever made about entering politics out of a sense of national duty. Someone in Washington knew what was coming before Ottawa did. Now, layer onto this the explosive testimony of a former senior Liberal Party strategist who spoke anonymously to two Canadian investigative outlets last week. According to this source, in the summer of 2024, a legal intermediary representing interests connected to the Trump political operation made contact with a member of Carney's transition team. The message delivered was precise and clinical. The documents exist, they are verified, and their release can be timed. The implication was not a threat in the traditional sense. It was described by the source as a calibration conversation, a signal that Carney's future operational freedom as Prime Minister would exist within boundaries that had already been defined by people he had never publicly acknowledged knowing. If this account is accurate, Mark Carney did not walk into Rideau Cottage as a free man. He walked in already carrying the weight of a leash held by hands on the other side of the border. And yet, the most dangerous revelation in Section 2 of the Project Maple architecture isn't about money, isn't about the Meridian Group, and isn't about back-channel threats from Washington. It is about a single encrypted file within the Project Maple folder that investigators have not yet been able to fully decrypt. Designated internally as Maple Core, this file is reportedly protected by a dual-key encryption system that requires authorization from two separate individuals to open. One of those keys has already been identified. The other belongs to someone currently holding a senior position inside the Canadian government. The file has not been opened, but the metadata surrounding it, the creation date, the access logs, the file size, tells its own story. Maple Core was last accessed on the night of the Canadian federal election. Someone opened that file the night Carney won, and whatever is inside it, both key holders know exactly what it contains. The only question now is which one of them will break first and what they are willing to sacrifice to make sure the other one stays silent. What happens when the most carefully constructed political persona in the Western world begins to crack? Not from the outside, not from an opponent's attack ad or a hostile press conference, but from within, from the weight of its own hidden foundations finally giving way under pressure they were never designed to withstand. That is the question Ottawa is quietly suffocating under right now. Because the Project Maple files have moved beyond the realm of allegation and into the territory of institutional crisis, and the tremors are already reaching places that Carney's damage control operation cannot contain. Within 48 hours of the first Project Maple leak circulating in Washington policy circles, three things happened simultaneously that no coincidence can adequately explain. First, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service quietly elevated its internal threat assessment for foreign document interference from moderate to critical. Second, two senior members of Carney's transition advisory team abruptly withdrew from their expected cabinet appointment processes without any public explanation. Third, a law firm in Toronto with documented historical ties to Carney's Post Bank of England consulting network filed an emergency injunction in Ontario Superior Court attempting to block the publication of any materials connected to what the filing carefully described as unlawfully obtained private financial correspondence. They did not deny the documents exist. They did not claim the contents were fabricated. They asked a court to stop anyone from publishing them. In the architecture of political scandal, that is not a defense. That is a confession dressed in legal language. The international dimension of this collapse is accelerating faster than Ottawa's response machinery can track. In Brussels, two senior European Commission officials privately briefed their national delegations that Carney's ability to serve as an effective counterweight to Washington in upcoming G7 trade negotiations must now be considered compromised, pending clarification of the Project Maple allegations. In London, the Financial Times ran a carefully worded editorial questioning whether the governance standards Carney championed during his Bank of England tenure were ever genuinely reflected in his private financial conduct. In Riyadh, a sovereign wealth fund with reported indirect exposure to the Meridian Group's infrastructure arrangements quietly suspended a bilateral clean energy financing agreement with Ottawa that had been 18 months in negotiation. The world is not waiting for Canadian courts to decide. The world is already adjusting to the possibility that Mark Carney is a diminished figure, and it is repositioning accordingly. Back in Washington, the House Judiciary Committee has now formally requested that the special counsel's office provide a full declassified summary of the Project Maple files within 30 days. This is not a casual administrative request. This is a legally binding demand that sets a clock running directly above Carney's head. When that summary lands, and it will land, the contents will enter the permanent public record of American federal oversight. Every transaction, every Meridian Group connection, every encrypted communication, every back-channel arrangement that the documents contain will become part of a document that any journalist, any opposition politician, and any foreign government can cite, reference, and build upon indefinitely. Carney's legal team can fight Canadian publication injunctions. They cannot erase an American federal summary from history. The most profound and unsettling truth buried inside the entire Project Maple scandal is not what it reveals about Mark Carney specifically. It is what it reveals about the system that produced him. In an era where voters across the Western world are desperately searching for leaders who represent something real, something unmanufactured and unbought, the possibility that even the most credentialed, the most intellectually celebrated, the most ostentatiously principled figures in global public life are operating inside the same hidden architecture of private interest and elite coordination as everyone else. That possibility is not just politically devastating, it is civilizationally corrosive. If Carney falls, he does not fall alone. He takes with him the last remaining argument that the globalist technocratic class had any moral authority left to stand on. Donald Trump has spent a decade telling the world that the experts are frauds, that the institutions are rigged, and that the people celebrated as the adults in the room are the most dangerous children of all. Every single person who dismissed that argument, every commentator, every editorial board, every world leader who positioned themselves as a sane alternative pointed to figures like Mark Carney as proof that Trump was wrong. If Project Maple is real, if the documents hold, if the 30-day clock runs out and the summary says what the sources claim it says, then Trump was not wrong. And that verdict, more than any trade war, more than any tariff, more than any territorial threat against Canada, will be the most destructive thing Donald Trump has ever unleashed upon the Western order. The files are coming. The clock is running. And somewhere in Ottawa tonight, a man who told an entire nation he had nothing to hide is watching.